Chicago on the sunny summer.
Every one of these acts built something bigger than themselves. Harmonies you couldn't fake, songs that made careers, empires, some of them. And then, one by one, the people who built those empires together turned on each other. Lawsuits, firings, decades of silence. One man legally erased from a band he helped make famous. This is the real story behind 12 of the most bitter breakups and betrayals in country music history. Number 12, the Stoneman Family, early 1960s. Scotty was one of 23 children born to Ernest Pop Stoneman, one of the earliest recorded stars of what would become country music, and his wife Hattie, a fiddler and banjo player herself. Growing up in a family that thoroughly steeped in music from birth, Scotty was, by nearly universal agreement among the musicians who played with him, one of the most electrifying fiddlers bluegrass music ever produced. Jerry Garcia of the Grateful Dead called him the Bluegrass Charlie Parker. He learned to play from his grandfather, a traditional Virginia fiddler, and by his mid-teens was already beating grown men at prestigious fiddle contests across the South. He was also, from around age 15 onward, fighting a losing battle with alcohol. Performing alongside his siblings in the family's band, first as the Bluegrass Champs and later as the Stonemans, Scotty's drinking became so disruptive that he was repeatedly fired from his own family's act, only to be brought back in when his playing was simply too good to replace. It happened again and again through the late 1950s and early 60s, a cycle of talent and self-destruction that his own family couldn't seem to break. In 1964, Scotty finally left the Stonemans for good, joining the California bluegrass outfit, the Kentucky Colonels, where many musicians consider his playing reached its absolute peak. But the drinking never stopped. He tried repeatedly to get sober in the early 1970s, stepping away from music entirely at one point in the attempt. It wasn't enough. In March of 1973, Scotty Stoneman died of alcohol poisoning at just 40 years old, the most gifted member of one of country music's great pioneering families, undone by a struggle his own siblings had spent over a decade trying and failing to save him from. His sisters carried the family name forward without him. Ronnie Stoneman became a beloved fixture on the television show Hee Haw for 19 years, and their father's own late career success on a television quiz show in 1956 had already proven the Stonemans could reinvent themselves, just never quite in time to save Scotty from the habit that had first pulled him out of the family band decades earlier. Number 11, Tompall and the Glaser Brothers, 1973. Tompall, Chuck, and Jim Glaser started singing together as preteens at country fairs around Spalding, Nebraska, and by the late 1950s had caught the attention of Marty Robbins himself, who signed them to his label and put them on tour as his backing vocalists. Jim Glaser can be heard singing harmony on Robbins' signature hit, El Paso.
Ring, ring, doorbell ring, baby.
The brothers built something bigger together in Nashville, a shared publishing company, and eventually a recording studio just blocks from Music Row. Their biggest hit, 1971's Rings, reached number 7 on the Billboard country chart.
I'm glad you come.
But as the group's sound started shifting, Tompall pushing toward the rawer, rougher style that would soon define outlaw country, tensions between the three brothers escalated into what one biographer flatly called a familial fallout.
Ring, golden ring, around the sun, around your pretty.
In 1973, the group split apart. Chuck went into artist booking. Jim pursued a solo career that never quite caught fire, though he'd eventually land his own #1 hit over a decade later. Tompall, meanwhile, walked away from the split, holding the one asset the brothers had built together and valued most, their shared studio.
The sun comes up across.
He renamed it Hillbilly Central and turned it into the literal birthplace of the outlaw country movement, recording Waylon Jennings and Billy Joe Shaver there, while his own brothers watched the label that all three of them had founded become associated with just one name.
Of the universe.
Jim eventually found his own measure of vindication more than a decade later, finally landing his first and only solo #1 hit with You're Gettin' to Me Again in 1984. Proof that even after the split, the youngest Glaser brother could still climb to the very top the group had once reached together.
With prose and verse, the beach.
Number 10, Buck Owens and the Buckaroos, 1960s.
Together again.
Don Rich, Doyle Hawley, Tom Brumley, and Willie Cantu built the Buckaroos into one of the tightest, most influential backing bands in country music history, the engine behind Buck Owens' stripped-down, twangy Bakersfield sound and 14 consecutive #1 hits in the 1960s. According to Owens' own biographer, the arrangement wasn't quite as equal as it looked from the outside. Most of the band earned around $75 a week, even as Owens' records topped the charts, a fraction of what the man out front was making. When Owens finally gave steel guitarist Tom Brumley a raise, it became something of a historic moment in the band's history, precisely because raises from Owens were so rare.
We're together again.
There was a quieter betrayal buried underneath the pay gap, too. According to accounts from multiple former band members, Owens deliberately withheld outside recording opportunities from his own musicians, including, in Brumley's case, an offer to record with Ray Charles, simply never telling them the offers existed because he didn't want a bigger name poaching his talent.
These guys are gone.
The band members themselves were the ones expected to drive their own tour bus, with no extra pay for the labor, even after their leader could easily afford otherwise. And Owens himself reportedly kept touring in an old pickup truck camper for years after his first #1 hits, partly out of the same tight-fisted habits he applied to his own band's paychecks. Rich stayed loyal until his death in a 1974 motorcycle accident. Several others eventually moved on, chasing exactly the kind of outside opportunities Owens had spent years quietly keeping from them. Ironically, it had been a young, then unknown Merle Haggard, briefly playing bass for Owens back in 1962, who'd first suggested the band's name, a small footnote that outlasted almost everyone's tenure in the group except Owens' own.
If you're locked into this one, most people scrolling past these songs have no idea what it took to make them. We digs that history back up, one record at a time. The subscribe button costs nothing, and it means you won't miss the next one.
Number 9. The Wilburn Brothers and Loretta Lynn, 1960s to 2004.
Trebles back and back.
Doyle and Teddy Wilburn were established Grand Ole Opry stars, hosting their own long-running syndicated television program, The Wilburn Brothers Show, when they discovered a young singer from Kentucky named Loretta Lynn in the early 1960s after hearing her self-penned debut single, I'm a Honky Tonk Girl.
Uh-oh, trouble's back in town.
They gave her national exposure on their program and helped land her a deal with Decca Records, the kind of career-launching support few new artists ever received.
Coming back to torture me.
In exchange, in 1966, Lynn signed a songwriter's agreement with the Wilburn's publishing company, Surefire Music, without independent legal representation of her own. The same attorney who represented the company also represented her in the negotiation.
Back in town.
That single contract locked up the copyrights to 114 of her songs, including You Ain't Woman Enough, Fist City, and her signature song, Coal Miner's Daughter, songs that would go on to define an entire genre and earn Surefire enormous ongoing royalties for decades.
Wish I did.
Doyle Wilburn died in 1982. Teddy died in 2003. Only after both brothers were gone did Loretta Lynn finally file suit in October of 2004, seeking to void the 40-year-old contract entirely, citing a clause that let her walk away if ownership of the company ever changed hands. It had taken the men who discovered her passing away before Loretta Lynn could even attempt to reclaim the rights to songs about her own life that she had written herself.
Time has brought so change.
Her manager put the imbalance plainly at the time. Surefire had enjoyed the benefits of Loretta's success as a songwriter and entertainer for more than 40 years, while the artist herself had spent those same 4 decades unable to fully control the very story she'd first started telling from a one-room cabin in Butcher Hollow. Number 8. Bill Monroe and the Men Who Left His Band, 1948 to 1969. Bill Monroe built bluegrass music from the ground up with his band, the Bluegrass Boys, inventing an entire genre from scratch, one that would eventually take its name directly from his home state of Kentucky. 2 of the musicians who helped him do it were guitarist Lester Flatt and banjo player Earl Scruggs. In 1948, Flatt and Scruggs left Monroe's band to form their own group, using a sound modeled directly on the one they'd helped Monroe create. Monroe took it as a personal betrayal, and by most accounts, he never fully let it go.
The one that's gone and said goodbye.
He reportedly refused to speak to either man for years and actively lobbied to keep them off the Grand Ole Opry when they became eligible for membership in 1955, though some historians argue the freeze specifically intensified around that Opry dispute, rather than being a full 2 decades of total silence from the very start, as the popular legend claims. Whatever its exact shape, the rift lasted a genuinely long time. It wasn't until 1969, the same year Flatt and Scruggs themselves finally split apart, that Monroe and Lester Flatt reconciled at a bluegrass festival in Bean Blossom, Indiana, playing together publicly for the first time in over 2 decades. Monroe and Earl Scruggs took even longer to fully mend fences, not sharing a stage together again until 1994, just 2 years before Monroe's death, nearly half a century after 2 of his own musicians walked out, and in his eyes took his own sound with them. Monroe's signature song, Blue Moon of Kentucky, would itself go on to be reinvented by an unlikely admirer. A young Elvis Presley recorded his own rock and roll version of it in 1954, introducing Monroe's bluegrass writing to an entirely new generation, decades before the old man ever fully forgave the 2 players who'd once carried that same sound out the door. Number 7. Flatt and Scruggs, 1969. After leaving Bill Monroe's band together in 1948, Lester Flatt and Earl Scruggs spent the next 2 decades building one of the most successful and influential partnerships bluegrass music ever produced, appearing in the 1967 film Bonnie and Clyde, hosting their own syndicated radio and television programs, and capped by The Ballad of Jed Clampett, the theme from the Beverly Hillbillies, becoming the first #1 bluegrass single in history in 1963. By the late 1960s, though, the 2 men wanted fundamentally different things from their music. Scruggs, pushed partly by his wife and manager Louise, wanted to chase a younger, more contemporary audience, recording Bob Dylan covers, playing rock venues, adding drums and electric instruments. Flatt, a committed traditionalist, hated nearly all of it and dug in harder the more Scruggs pushed. On March 11, 1969, after 21 years together, Flatt and Scruggs formally ended their partnership. Flatt formed the Nashville Grass to keep playing pure, old-school bluegrass, eventually bringing a teenage Marty Stewart into the fold. Scruggs launched the Earl Scruggs Review with his own sons, chasing exactly the contemporary sound Flatt had refused to make, and performed to as many as 500,000 anti-war protesters in Washington, D.C. that same year. The two men discussed reuniting a decade later in 1979, but Flatt died of a heart attack before it could happen, leaving 21 years of shared history to end on the note both men had fought over instead of one they'd agreed on. Dobro player Josh Graves, who'd played alongside both men through the split, later put the tragedy of the whole affair simply. When they worked together in Monroe's old band, he said, they were the best of friends. And to him, that early chemistry was the truest form bluegrass music ever took. Number 6, the Louvin Brothers, 1963.
That's when I stopped.
Ira and Charlie Louvin built one of the most influential close harmony duos in country music history, a sound so tightly interwoven that even careful listeners sometimes lost track of which brother was singing lead, a technique later musicologists would call voice exchange.
If I could forget.
Their influence would eventually run straight through the Byrds, Graham Parsons, and Emmylou Harris. But behind the harmony was a childhood of real violence. Their father beat them both, with fists, switches, and whatever else was within reach. And Ira, the older brother, absorbed the worst of it.
In spring alone.
That damage followed Ira into adulthood as severe alcoholism worsened after a Capitol Records producer publicly criticized his mandolin playing in the late 1950s and suggested the duo drop the instrument entirely to sound more like the Everly Brothers.
Neglected, transplanted in vain.
Ira's drinking grew violent and erratic. In February of 1963, his own third wife shot him 6 times during an alcohol-fueled argument, leaving 3 bullets permanently lodged in his body.
Where the petals will fall.
By the summer of 1963, Charlie had simply had enough. He ended the act and the brothers went their separate ways, each launching solo careers. Charlie's daughter, Kathy Louvin, later said promoters treated Charlie as though he were equally responsible for Ira's chaos, even though Charlie had spent years quietly shielding the rest of the family from his brother's volatility.
They teach the flowers to bloom.
Ira never got the chance to fully rebuild on his own. He was killed in a car accident less than 2 years after the breakup, at just 41 years old, cutting short whatever reconciliation the two brothers might eventually have found.
A pebble and teach it to grow.
Decades later, a tribute album featuring artists across genres covering their catalog would carry the fitting title Livin', Lovin', Losin', Songs of the Louvin Brothers, a phrase that captured in 3 words the entire arc of two brothers whose voices blended perfectly even when their lives never could.
That's when I'll stop.
Number 5, Alabama and Mark Herndon, 1979 to 2013. Mark Herndon joined Alabama as its drummer in 1979, right before the group signed with RCA and launched into one of the most dominant runs in country music history, 27 #1 hits and 7 multi-platinum albums through the 1980s, including the smash single Mountain Music in 1982. Herndon appeared on every album cover alongside Randy Owens, Teddy Gentry, and Jeff Cook, toured the world with them, and stood beside them when the group was inducted into the Country Music Hall of Fame in 2005. Then, quietly, the story started to change. Owen later told reporters that Herndon had actually never been an official member of Alabama at all, that RCA's own label executives had insisted on picturing 4 people specifically to invite comparisons to the Beatles, and that studio session drummers, not Herndon, had played on most of the actual recordings. In 2008, Alabama sued Herndon for roughly $200,000 in alleged overpayments following the band's farewell tour. Herndon denied the claims. When Owen, Gentry, and Cook reunited Alabama for a new run of shows in 2013, Herndon was left out entirely, edited out of promotional material and, fans noticed, cropped out of older photographs. It took until August of 2025, more than a decade later, and after Jeff Cook's death in 2022, for Herndon to finally rejoin his former bandmates on stage, performing mountain music together for the first time since the band's original farewell tour, closing a riff that had quietly rewritten the official story of one of country music's biggest acts. Bassist Teddy Gentry offered a simple explanation for the long-overdue reunion. The good Lord blesses us sometimes to do things that we can't do. All we can do is kind of be in the wings and kind of hope for things. Number 4, The Oak Ridge Boys, 1987. William Lee Golden's waist-length beard and mountain man look had been part of the Oak Ridge Boys' identity since the 1970s, as recognizable to fans as the group's booming harmonies on hits like Elvira and Bobby Sue. He'd been a member of the group since 1965, first as part of a traditional Southern gospel act before the Oaks transitioned into mainstream country, longer than anyone else in the lineup. By the mid-1980s, the other three members, Dwayne Allen, Joe Bonsall, and Richard Sturban, wanted a cleaner, more contemporary image, and felt Golden's increasingly wild appearance and lifestyle no longer matched where they wanted to take the group. In the spring of 1987, the Oaks voted Golden out entirely, replacing him with Steve Sanders, a member of their backing band who'd go on to sing lead on their 1988 #1 hit, Gonna Take a Lot of River. Allen later put it bluntly to the Chicago Tribune: if he couldn't see the handwriting on the wall, he was not looking at the wall. The legal settlement that followed required Golden to forfeit all future royalties on every recording made during his more than 2 decades with the group. He spent 9 years mostly outside the spotlight before Sanders resigned in January of 1996, clearing the way for Golden's return. When the 4 original members finally sang together again for the first time in nearly a decade, Golden said he could barely get through the closing line of their own 1983 song, Ozark Mountain Jubilee, "If I can't be the favorite son, I'll be the prodigal one," without choking back tears. The group's return to their classic lineup came with an unexpected kindness from strangers, too. Golden's replacement, Steve Sanders, had left the Oaks in January of 1996, and even the local mail carrier who delivered Golden's fan letters left him a note that year saying simply how glad he was that William Lee Golden was coming back. Number 3, The Everly Brothers, 1973. Don and Phil Everly had been performing together since childhood, touring with their parents as a family act before becoming one of the defining duos of the rock and roll era with Bye Bye Love, Wake Up Little Susie, and Kathy's Clown. Phil later said the tension between the two brothers existed from birth and would go on forever. By 1973, years of quiet resentment and mounting substance issues had pushed the brothers to plan a hiatus. 2 shows at Knott's Berry Farm in California on July 13th and 14th, meant to be an amicable pause before a planned 2-year break. The first night went fine. On the second, Don walked on stage visibly drunk, slurring words and forgetting lyrics in front of a stunned audience, something bandmates said they had genuinely never witnessed from him before, even once, in years of touring. Partway through the show, Phil had seen enough. He smashed his guitar on the stage floor, told the promoter, "I can't go back on stage with that man again," and walked off entirely, leaving Don to finish the final set alone. Warren Zevon, playing piano in the backing band that night, said he'd seen Don perform once with a 103-degree fever without ever hitting a sour note. But that night, dead drunk, he was stumbling and off-key in a way nobody in the band had ever witnessed. Don told the booing crowd flatly, "The Everly Brothers died 10 years ago." What was supposed to be a 2-year break stretched into a full decade of near-total silence between the two brothers, before they finally reunited for a comeback concert at London's Royal Albert Hall in September of 1983. Number 2, George Jones and Tammy Wynette, 1975. George Jones and Tammy Wynette married in February of 1969 under genuinely dramatic circumstances. Jones had reportedly flown into a jealous rage after watching Wynette's second husband mistreat her during an argument at her own home, flipped over a coffee table and blurted out that he loved her, all in the same night. They quickly became country music's biggest power couple, recording duet after duet together while both maintained enormously successful solo careers of their own. Wynette scoring her own string of #1 hits, even as the marriage itself grew increasingly strained behind the scenes. The marriage that started with that kind of intensity ended with an equal amount of it. Jones's alcoholism spiraled severely through the early 1970s, and the couple divorced in 1975 after 6 turbulent years together, with Wynette later describing periods of real fear during the marriage's final stretch. Remarkably, the two continued recording hit duets together for years afterward, including Golden Ring and Near You, turning their own very public, very messy divorce into some of the most emotionally raw material of their careers, sung by the two people who had actually lived it. The echoes ran even deeper than the songs. 5 years after their divorce in 1980, Jones would go on to record He Stopped Loving Her Today, a song about a man who never stops loving the woman who left him. Jones later admitted the lyrics cut close enough to his failed marriage to Wynette that he could barely make it through the recording sober, turning a song about a fictional heartbreak into an almost unbearably direct reflection of the real one. Number 1, Dolly Parton and Porter Wagoner, 1974 to 1979.
I would only be in.
Porter Wagoner discovered Dolly Parton in 1967, giving the relatively unknown 21-year-old singer a permanent spot on his popular syndicated television show and turning her into a national star through years of hit duets like The Last Thing on My Mind and Please Don't Stop Loving Me. Parton has said Wagoner could also be domineering and controlling. She later called him bluntly a male chauvinist pig, and the two clashed constantly over the 7 years they worked together, in disputes she'd later describe as no more his fault than her own.
Goodbye.
In February of 1974, riding the momentum of her solo hit Jolene, Parton told Wagoner she was leaving to pursue her own career independently. Rather than deliver the news in an argument, she wrote him a song instead, sat him down, and sang it to him directly. I Will Always Love You. Wagoner reportedly wept and told her it was the prettiest song he'd ever heard, and even offered to produce her recording of it himself. The peace didn't last. In March of 1979, Wagoner sued Parton for $3 million, claiming her departure had forced him to cancel tours and that he was entitled to a share of her earnings for the career he'd helped build. Parton settled out of court rather than fight it, later writing, I made up my mind that if he could live with it, I could live without it.
And I just hope that
The two didn't fully reconcile until decades later, standing together on stage at the Grand Ole Opry in 2007 to celebrate Wagoner's 50th anniversary as a member. where Parton sang him the very same farewell song one more time, this time with all the anger long since drained out of it.